Hey everybody, so get your Bibles out here. This is going to be a fun one. Hopefully I don't lose you too much here in the beginning, but I want to look at Daniel chapter 9 in this session, but I want to look at a couple of other passages first to try to give you some context and to also kind of make an argument a little bit in terms of how important this is. So in Daniel chapter 9, notice that we are specifically told when this happens. Daniel tells us that this is a vision under Darius's first year. And remember, I've made the argument that Darius and Cyrus are different people. There are some scholars that believe they're one and the same. But let's look back at chapter 6, I believe it is. Let me go back and make sure I'm telling you the truth myself so that you can see something. And then we're also going to look at a passage in Ezra to try to piece all this together, because it's really important, because it kind of tells us something about, obviously, that Daniel has to be talking about, more last days type of stuff. I'll try to make that clear here in just a second. So turn back to chapter 6 and notice that Daniel chapter 6 tells us that it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one. Now, as I told you last time, that Daniel chapters 5 and 6 came before Daniel chapter 9. The sequence of Daniel is such that you can kind of figure all those out. I do want to make it clear here that you could, and some do, but not very many, make it very strong. You could technically say you're not exactly sure when Daniel chapter 6 takes place, because it just says it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom. But it doesn't say, well, when during Darius's kingdom does this happen? Now, this is important because Daniel chapter 6 follows chapter 5, and so the most likely perspective is that this happened early in Darius's reign, probably his first year. That being the case, that would mean that the vision that we're going to talk about today in Daniel chapter 9 happens probably after the issue with the lion's den. And that makes sense, because the lion's den is what really probably launched Daniel into even a stronger position in terms of his popularity, if you will, and his standing with the Persian government. Look at chapter 10 real quick, because this gives us another interesting bits of information, and then we'll look at Ezra, and hopefully this is all making sense. So hopefully I'm not losing you here. In chapter 10, verse 1, it says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So there's a 3-year period there between Daniel chapter 9 and Daniel chapter 10. I'm assuming that Darius's first year is also this first year of Cyrus, and some could debate that. But here's what we do know. Turn back to the book of Ezra. I know this is maybe a little bit confusing, but it really helps piece together everything. In Ezra chapter 1, the very first verse, notice that we learn something really important. It says, now in the 1st year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord that by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing. So the proclamation that you'll see in the rest of there in 1st chapter of Ezra is the proclamation that Cyrus is going to allow the Jewish people to begin returning to their homeland. This is important because Daniel chapter 9 is going to be the prediction, or I should say the fulfillment of that beginning to happen, because Daniel in chapter 9 realizes that it is time for Jeremiah's prophecy to be fulfilled. And Ezra refers to that being the 1st or the 3rd year of King Cyrus. So that gives us a really strong clue that Daniel chapter 9 happens pretty early on because it influences Cyrus. Because by Cyrus's third year already, he is allowing the Jewish people to go back. I hope that all makes sense. And because the Bible tells us that Daniel was lifted to a position of power in the Persian Empire under Darius, and remember, I believe Darius is a local leader. And in fact, in Daniel chapter 6, if you look at the very last verse of Daniel chapter 6, it tells us, so this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So I believe that it's two different people. There are some Bible scholars that believe that verse can be read, that Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, who is Cyrus the Persian. In either case, the point is that this happens in the first few years of the Persian Empire. And that's really important because there's two key things going on here. We have the fulfillment of Jeremiah's 70-year prophecy. Remember, he prophesied that the Israelite people would be in captivity for 70 years, and then they would be allowed to return. And then we learn from Ezra that begins the third year of Cyrus. But Daniel chapter 9 tells us much more than just that return. And I'm going to show you that here in just a second. But it's important to understand, obviously, this is talking about this time period. And so everything that's going to happen now in Daniel chapter 9, and especially in chapters 10, 11, and 12, happen in the context of the Jewish people are returning to their land. That's important because that tells us that everything that Daniel's talking about has to be future from beyond that. So it can't refer to them coming back at that time. That's really, really important to understand. So when he begins to prophesy about the people coming back, it has to be another time period in the future where the Jewish people are coming back to their land. Now, some people would argue, well, that's kind of been what's happening for the next 400 years after Daniel, and then that happened again, during the Roman Empire. But none of those really fit that explanation very well because they're very piecemeal, if you will. There's not really a large group of people, of Jewish people, that come back. In fact, really the only closest thing you could say that probably fits the Jewish people coming back to their homeland is in our time, 1948. Well, that's a little bit before my time, at least, but it's in our basic last couple hundred years here, where the Jewish people have been allowed to start coming back. But what I'm going to argue, and what I have been arguing with you several times, is no, there's still a really major, if you will, remnant coming back to Israel that are going to especially be people that are totally committed to God, and specifically that Jesus Christ is their Messiah. So there's still I believe, a future fulfillment that Daniel is referring to. But I did want you to see the context and the timing to understand. When you put all these pieces of the puzzle together and you realize the timing that's going on here, that Daniel is literally being able to witness his people going back to Israel, and yet he's prophesying that there's really bad days still coming. Because you would have thought, well, they just went through bad days being in captivity. But Daniel is seeing his people go back now, so he has to be talking about a future event that's still going to come. Now, I admit, and some scholars will argue, well, yeah, he's talking about the whole stuff of Antiochus Epiphanes that's going to come several hundred years after this. But as I've made the argument, and as a lot of other, actually probably most scholars do make the argument, but that doesn't all fit because Jesus hasn't returned in his second coming after Antiochus Epiphanes. In fact, he hadn't even come the first time yet. So that's why I think it's pretty clear that Daniel is talking about some future things. So with that background, and if none of that made sense, maybe rewind and watch it again, or stop here and go back and read those different passages. Daniel chapter 6, and the first verse and last verse of that chapter, Daniel chapter 9, first verse, Daniel chapter 10, first verse, and then go back to Ezra, first verse of that book, and just think through the chronology of everything that's being said in all those passages and what's happening. And I think you'll get a pretty clear picture of the timing here, that Daniel is definitely now shifting. Well, I don't want to say shifting, but because he's witnessing his people going back, he realizes now that all these things that God is showing him are things that still have to happen in the future. The people going back isn't going to fulfill that, because Daniel's still talking about somebody really bad coming. So it can't apply to anything before that. Can't even apply to Persia, because they're letting the people go back. So it's pretty clear that he knows that there's a future day coming. So Daniel chapter 9 is obviously one of the most talked about and one of the most important, to where we get the whole idea of a 7-year tribulation. And I'm going to touch some bases with this, but I do want to make a quick little comment too, that if you really get into this stuff and you really want to dive into it some more, and I will put these links eventually into my website as well, but Joel Richardson and let's see, and there's another gentleman and his name is escaping me right now, but I'll put their links up, that they get into Daniel chapter 9 and really all of Daniel even more so than I'm going to with you here. And I think for 95 to 90% of the stuff that they share is probably right on, because they are really looking at where it all fits. And it's not that necessarily a lot of what they're saying is necessarily new and improved or anything like that, but they just have a good way of explaining it and making sense of how it all fits together. So I'm just going to kind of whet your appetite with it, and like I said, if you really want to get into it even more and understand the timing of it all, I'm going to kind of steer you to them. However, I think what I'm going to share with you will be pretty straightforward. So in Daniel chapter 9, if you don't have your Bibles open, turn back to that now. And as I said, it's the first year of Darius. So I think this, in my personal opinion, I think this actually happens after the lion's den. Now the lion's den could have been after this, but it had to happen, I think, within a 3-year time period, because Daniel chapter 10 is when Cyrus allows, or Ezra tells us that's when Cyrus allows the people to go back. So Daniel's vision, which we are told in chapter 10 is the 3rd year. So I'm thinking that the lion's den and this vision in chapter 9 had to be really close to each other. That's the important thing to think. I think it makes the most sense that the lion's den happened before this, because now he's a person in power and he's able to really focus more on what's going to happen now with my people. So in Daniel chapter 9, I read verse 1 to you. Verse 2 is especially the important one. It says, in the 1st year of his reign, I, Daniel, and this is talking about the 1st year of Darius, who I believe also coincides with the 1st year of Cyrus, because I think Darius and Cyrus represent the Medes and the Persians, those two branches, Darius being the Medes and Cyrus being the Persians. And so that's allowing that combined kingdom, if you will, to come about. So in that 1st year, verse 2, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So Daniel is realizing now, hey, Jeremiah prophesied 70 years, and then my people get to start going back. And, Daniel keeps the calendar like any wise person would. And it's been 70 years since he himself was taken captive to Babylon. And remember, he was in that first captivity. So that's really when the whole desolations of Jerusalem in that time began. Even though Jerusalem wasn't completely ransacked at that point, that's when it really began. And because Daniel, who's a great man of God, we know that, I think we need to take his interpretation of when the 70 years began. I think that makes the most sense, because some people will try to put that 70 years at a different time period, but that doesn't make sense to me. If Daniel is saying it's 70 years, he's thinking in his experience. He's thinking it's when the first captivity happened, which is when really the downfall of Jerusalem began. So that's when the 70 years begins in his mind, and he's thinking that. Then he does this incredible prayer, and I'm not going to go through the whole prayer, but it's amazing. It starts in verse 3, and he's really repenting for his own people. He's begging the Lord for mercy and forgiveness, and he's asking the Lord to fulfill this word that Jeremiah had prophesied. And as we know from Ezra chapter 1, sure enough, Cyrus in his 3rd year allows the Jewish people to start going back. So Jeremiah's prophecy was right on the money. And if you look at the time frame, that 3rd year of Cyrus is exactly 70 years from when Daniel was taken captivity in Babylon. That first captivity where a bunch of Jewish people, a lot of the top leaders, Daniel being one of them and his buddies, were taken captive into Babylon. So that's when it started, and now in the 3rd year of Cyrus, it's been 70 years. It's a phenomenal prophecy. It's right on the money. It's very accurate, which is how prophecy should be, by the way. Not to take a little tangent there, but true prophets, their prophecies come true. That's just a little side note for what it's worth. You can apply that however you want. You've seen how I think about that. So anyway, he prays, and then let's skip to verse 20, because this is where it gets really interesting, and why Daniel chapter 9 is so fascinating, and why it's looked at so many, Jesus' first coming, and kind of alludes to a second coming as well. So here's what happens. He's praying, he's begging the Lord for mercy. He's on his face, praying before the Lord, sackcloth and ashes. It's got the whole thing of repentance and whatnot. Verse 20. While I was praying, or while I was speaking, praying, and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, I think that's awesome. He's realizing, hey, this just isn't that everybody else needs to repent. I need to repent. And he presents his supplication before the Lord for the holy mountain of my God. The holy mountain, obviously, is Jerusalem. Verse 21, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, remember Gabriel's come to Daniel before in explaining some of his visions to him, so he comes again. He caused, and Gabriel, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. I don't think that we know anywhere exactly what day of this week is, but there is an evening offering every week or every day. So this is obviously in the sundown time frame. So what happens? What does Gabriel share with Daniel? And this is really, really important so that you can see this. And he informed me and talked with me and said, "O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand." At the beginning of your supplication, so the minute Daniel started praying, although Daniel has probably been seeing this and noticing this for some time, but I think the point here is that especially at the beginning of this prayer that we have in Daniel chapter 12, when Daniel really began to pray this, because he knows now the 70 years are approaching, that it's time. So at the beginning of your supplication, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved, therefore consider the matter and understand the vision. And it's like, well, wait a minute. What's the vision being referred to here? Well, apparently, not only did God give Daniel some more vision about what's happening, but the vision that Daniel referred to was Jeremiah's prophecy about the 70 years. Does that make sense? Now, it could be some of his previous visions as well, being all tied together, but in terms of context, the vision that Daniel's referring to is Jeremiah's vision, the prophecy of the 70 years. So what Gabriel just told Daniel, hey Daniel, I'm going to give you some more understanding about this 70-year prophecy. And what he's going to tell him, and we'll see that in here just a second, is that there's more to it than just the 70 years. And that's going to be seen in the very next verse. Look at verse 24. Gabriel says to Daniel, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. Now just stop right there. Look back at verse 2. The prophecy from Jeremiah was 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. But Gabriel just said, yeah, but Daniel, there's more to it. There's 70 weeks determined for your people. Now, some people could say, well, Doug, you're just kind of nitpicking there, different words. And what Gabriel is telling Daniel, yeah, the 70 years is being fulfilled, and here is going to be fulfilled right here and now in this 70 years, and when the people of Israel get to go back. Here's the problem with that interpretation. Look at the rest of verse 24 and 25. Those are things that definitely were not fulfilled when the people began to go back under Ezra in the 3rd year of Cyrus, which would be the 70 years. Because look what it says. Gabriel's, speaking here to Daniel. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, if you stop and think about what Gabriel just told Daniel, you have to realize that that did not get fulfilled with the people of Israel going back 70 years that Jeremiah had prophesied. Jeremiah was absolutely right about the 70 years that the people get to go back, but Gabriel just expanded that vision, expanded that prophecy, which is so cool because that's so true. God so many times will prophecy is so much bigger than what it appears on the surface. There's just so much more to it. It speaks to his divine revelation for sure. So he just said, hey, Daniel, it's not just the 70 years, but there's 70 weeks of prophecy that needs to get fulfilled here. It's 77s is what it basically talks about. And it's specifically where most scholars fall, and I totally agree with this. I'm going to show you why here in a second, why it has to be the only way that it works, is that I believe he has just given Daniel a prophecy of 490 years, so 70 times 7, the 77s, which, as I've alluded to before, it's that same, it's a prophecy of the future, of forever. What happens in this 490 years? And he's going to break it down here and show us how it all plays out. So this is, I believe, the correct context because nothing else fits. If you try to say, well, there's going to be another 490, well, for starters, as I said, it doesn't fit the 70 years. The only thing that fits that is that the people get to trickle back to Jerusalem. And as I think I've made clear to you guys many, many times, the people that go back after 70 years during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, they're a remnant, yes, but they are a fairly small group, and they certainly do not build any temple even closely compared to what even Solomon had, let alone what Ezekiel prophesies. So what they did in that time period, in that 70 years, doesn't compare to what's prophesied about what's supposed to happen with the Messiah coming back. So we know that the 77s has to be more than that 70 years. Taking 490 days, some people will say, well, no, he's referring to the 70 weeks. So maybe it's 490 days. That's really not anywhere in there, but some do that. Well, there's nothing that fits that anywhere. What's 490 days? That's like a little over a year. So that doesn't fit anything that happened in history. If you say, well, it's 490 years, yes, but it's 490 years that are completely fulfilled from this point forward, that gets problematic too because nothing substantial happened. 490 years happened. Now, something definitely happened 483 years after this, but then 7 years after that, really nothing substantial happened. So there's got to be something going on with this 490 years. It has to be looked at in a very unique way. And I think the answer is in the scriptures itself. Because this 490 years, Gabriel literally breaks this up into 3 pieces for us. So that tells me if he breaks it up into 3 pieces, then there must be some really distinct time periods that he's letting Daniel know, hey, the 70-year prophecy was a foreshadow of a 77s time period and prophecy that is yet to come for your people. So with that in mind, and it has to be a prophecy to the end of times, because look at verse 24, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy. In other words, for all vision and prophecy to be completely fulfilled and completed. This is telling us, he's telling Daniel, this is a prophecy that will be fulfilled finally when Jesus comes back and everything, vision and prophecy is done. It's been fulfilled, and to anoint the most holy. Jesus is sitting at Jerusalem, reigning and ruling. So this, I believe, Gabriel has told Daniel, this 77s, the 490 years, is definitely a clue I'm giving you to the end of days, the end of time. So with that in mind, look at verse 25, and we'll look at 25, 26, and 27 here, because it's important. He goes on and he explains then, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. So where I fall, and this is where I think most Bible people will fall, is that Gabriel just gave Daniel the starting point of that 490 years, the 70 weeks. When does it begin? It begins when there's a command going forth to build Jerusalem. Now, what you have to know here is that you can't confuse this. I guess you could, but I'll tell you why it doesn't work anywhere. You could say, well, this is clearly that command that Cyrus gave in Ezra chapter 1, that he's going to allow the people to go back. But specifically, it talks about building Jerusalem. And that's a really important clue, because Cyrus, really, when he sends the people back, when he allows the people to go back the first time, he allows them to return, and he sends stuff with them to begin building the temple. But he doesn't really give them really any permission to rebuild the city and to rebuild the walls. Now, I know that sounds backwards, but stop and think about that just from a political standpoint. Cyrus is thinking, and he knows Daniel. Daniel's a bigwig in the government now, because Darius put him in that position, and Cyrus certainly knows him now as well. He becomes a leader even under Cyrus. So he realizes he's kind of God's man to fulfill this prophecy of the 70 years, but he doesn't want to give up his kingdom either. So he's certainly not going to let the Jewish people go back and start rebuilding Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is the capital. He doesn't have a problem with them going back and starting the temple and worshiping again. So he feels, well, I'll fulfill that prophecy, but I'm certainly not going to let them begin building their whole capital, because they might then become their own country again. And he doesn't want that. He wants them to stay subject to him. So this is not, I don't believe, this is the prophecy of when the 490 years begins, in other words. I don't believe it's the one that Cyrus said you can go back to your land, the one that we have in Ezra chapter 1. And what helps support that is, if you start the 490 years from that point, there's really nothing substantial that happens in 490 years from that point. It doesn't give us, if you will, any kind of a prophetic clue as to anything that happens. So in other words, it's 490 years would begin then, and it takes us to kind of a nebulous time period where really nothing happened. So the better thing that you have to look for, well, was there a decree in history where the Jewish people were allowed to begin rebuilding Jerusalem and their city walls? And indeed, there is. And when you look at it at the starting date of the 490 years, this prophecy comes alive because it's a fascinating prediction of when the Jews were literally kind of expecting a Messiah to come. And that's why during the time of Jesus, the New Testament talked about in the fullness of time, they were expecting it. Herod himself wasn't even oblivious to the fact that, where is this king supposed to be born and stuff. They kind of knew that they were approaching that time period. And so therefore something big needs to be happening pretty soon. So let's look at that 490 years and let's see where it probably has to pan out and how all these years make sense. Notice again what I said, that Gabriel himself split this 490 years really into kind of three distinct time periods. He talked about going back 62 weeks, 7 weeks, and then 62 weeks. So there's the two periods. There's a 7-week period and there's a 62-week period, that leaves one left over. Where's that last week? If you skip down real quick to verse 27, then you'll see he'll confer with many for 1 week. So that's how you come up with the full 70 weeks. 62 plus 7 is 69 weeks, and then that last week in verse 27 is 70 weeks. So there's the three divisions, if you will, into those time periods. So how does that probably then play out? How are those three time periods looked at? And here's what I'm going to share with you. In verse 26, it says, after the 62 weeks, and this is important because Gabriel's telling Daniel, it's after the 62 weeks that you really need to pay attention, because something big's going to happen then, and then 1 more week is going to happen that something really big is going to happen. So those first 7 weeks, which if the weeks are representing years, so in those first 49 weeks that really nothing's really said about it except that it just tells us there's 7 weeks. The only thing we can do is go back in history and say, well, did something start happening 49 weeks after this first proclamation was? Because the first 7 weeks, guys, comes before the 62 weeks. So when you add that up, it's 69 weeks before anything really, really big happens. So everybody asks, and it is one of the bigger puzzles of the prophecy. Well, what is that first 7 weeks about? What's that 49 years period about? And the best thing that can be said there is that that's when this is happening during the period of the temple being rebuilt by this remnant that goes back. And certainly 49 years after that, there's a major breakthrough with the rebuilding of the Jerusalem and the cities and all that kind of stuff, after 49 years of rebuilding the city. So that seems to be where that 49 years is fulfilled. But candidly, we don't know a lot about that first 7 weeks. It really doesn't tell us anything. All the emphasis is upon the 62 weeks, which is after the first 49 weeks. And then what happens or 49 years, I should say. And then what happens when Jesus comes back. So I think that's probably what we need to just be honest and say, you know what, that first 49 years, once the proclamation of Jerusalem being able to rebuild, there's something big that happens at that point, but the scriptures don't really put a lot of emphasis on that. So we can only kind of speculate, and prophecy people do speculate different things that happen, and they all are good speculations. But again, until we get to heaven, I don't think we'll actually know, well, what was the 49 years really referring to there? Daniel or Gabriel, what was that going on? But we definitely know that if you put those 49 weeks together, 49 years, you put those together, the 7 weeks with the 62 weeks, we know that that's 69 weeks. So we definitely can start counting from the time that the proclamation goes forth that the city be rebuilt. We can count 69 weeks, which is 69 times 7. Remember, all these weeks are 7-year periods. So when you do that math, now you have a 483-year period that you can say, okay, what happens 483 years after that? Because that's the 69 weeks. That's what's fascinating. And that's really what Gabriel is giving us. And he tells us some clues, because he says in verse 26, and after the 62 weeks, which is after the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks, because you got to look at the progression of verse 25. He says, after that, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. Now, just about everybody says, well, that's totally a reference, and I believe it has to be a reference to Jesus dying on the cross and being cut off, not for himself. Who did Jesus die for? He died for us. He didn't die for himself. He died for us. And the people of the prince who is to come, this is verse 26, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Now again, think in context that Daniel knows his people are going back, so that desolation period has ending. So he is talking about a future desolation that has to be after the Messiah is cut off. So there's two opinions here. Is this a reference to the fact that Jesus died on the cross and that after that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed? And most people fit into that camp, and I tend to lean that way too. But the important thing is that after Jesus died and rose again, remember that a few years later in AD 70, that Jerusalem indeed is ransacked and it's destroyed. And so, all we know from this passage is that happens after the Messiah is cut off and not for himself. We know that some point after that, the people of the prince who is to come would be a reference to the Antichrist. So the people of that prince is a worldly people, and as I've shared with you in Sunday school class, specifically the Roman soldiers that really carried this out were from the divisions that came out of the Arab side. They were Arab mercenaries. They're the ones that really went and destroyed the temple. So this would seem to be a really clear reference to that period of AD 70. However, there are other scholars that say, no, this is after Jesus has died and raised again. So then this must be referring to a future temple that's going to get ransacked by the Antichrist and his people. And so that's what this is referring to. And in some cases, both of those situations actually could be correct, because we definitely know there is still another opportunity coming where the temple is going to be rebuilt, and the people of the prince who is to come, the Antichrist and his followers, are indeed going to ransack the temple. So both interpretations could be correct. That's what's interesting to notice about that passage, but they're definitely future. And I'm going to show you here just a second the math of how this all plays out. In verse 27 then it says, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. And this is why it gets a little bit difficult to say that the ransacking of the temple in verse 26 is the future one, because that seems to be something that happens later during the Antichrist, more in the middle of his timing. However, it could very much be that the Antichrist does do this, that the 7 years really does begin with him taking over the temple and kind of establishing a nice covenant with the people of Israel, but then breaking that in the middle. In either case, we know that this final week that's left over, which is 1 week, and remember a week is representative of 7 years. Here's that last 70th week in verse 27. It says, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. Who is the he? If you follow the grammar, the English grammar of it, the last he that it was referring to was not the Messiah, but it was the prince who is to come. And the fact that this is a limited kingdom, it's 1 week, it's 7 years. We know this isn't a reference to Christ, because Christ's kingdom is going to be eternal. So it says, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he, the Antichrist, shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So there's where the whole idea of a 7-year tribulation period comes from. So the first 483 years takes us to the time of Jesus. I'll show you all this in just a second. Just want you to get the big picture right now. Then a 7-year period is still to come after Jerusalem is destroyed, or it's at least taken over. There's a peace treaty made here. The prince who is to come, this Antichrist, he makes a peace treaty. But in the middle of that 7 weeks, so in the middle, the 3.5-year time period, in the middle of that, he breaks that, and then he is going to be destroyed then at the consummation, which is the end, when the desolate gets destroyed. That would be Jesus coming back at Armageddon and destroying the Antichrist and all the work that he's done. And then that would then fulfill, going back to verse 24, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, to finish the transgressions, and to make reconciliation for the iniquity. So this is a reference, I believe, Daniel chapter 9 is really telling us about the first and the second return of Christ. So there's that time period. Now this is where a lot of Bible scholars wrestle, and I understand the wrestling, because I wrestle with it too, everybody should, is why would we have, a 7-week period, then a 62-week period, and then this long gap, and then a 7-week period, or a 1-week period, another 7 years. It seems inconsistent in some ways. However, remember that this is not unusual with biblical prophecy, where you'll have a prophecy, but then there's this time period. And no matter what position you take, you have to admit that you are taking some kind of a time period, because you're looking at some kind of a gap. Even if you think this was all fulfilled with Antiochus Epiphanes, this time period, there's a gap there to get to him. Plus, it almost happens before. If you take the 490 years, it would require you to say that this happened before the 490 years period is again. So what those scholars will usually do, that take that position, they'll back up when the 490 years began. They'll go all the way back and say, well, that began during, the beginning of the 70 years with Jeremiah as well. Well, you can do that, but again, the problem is, it tells us that when this 490 years period is done, that vision and prophecy are fulfilled, and there's everlasting righteousness, and Jesus is on the throne, and the desolate is completely wiped out. Well, that hasn't happened yet. So that's why I think that interpretation, that it's all fulfilled already, becomes really problematic. The same thing with saying it was all fulfilled in 70 AD. Well, the time from Jesus's resurrection, 33 AD to 70 AD is like a little less than 40 years. That doesn't fit any of the prophecies anywhere. So that begins to be problematic, and that's a gap of time though too. You can say, well, the 7-week period then begins when Titus and the Roman army destroyed. But again, there's nothing there that fulfills any of these time periods. So with all that, that's why I think it makes the most sense that you have to say, well, the 483 years has been fulfilled, and we're still waiting for that 7-year period to be fulfilled. So that was kind of a long way of saying, I do believe that most of the scholars that believe there's a 7-year tribulation period, that's really kind of misnamed lots of times. It's Daniel's 70th week, this 1 week after hanging. I do think that most of them are actually correct in that. Where I think all the differences is when does the rapture take place within that 7 years? When does it start? All that kind of stuff. That's where there's not agreement in terms of what does it all look like, that 7-year period, and what's happening. But the 7 years itself, I think, is a fairly accurate depiction of something that we are looking towards in the future. And that, in other words, that hasn't happened yet. So with that, that's kind of the big overall picture of what I'm talking about there. So let me kind of just do this real quickly with you, and if you need to stop the video going along here, you can kind of see where I'm going. So the 77s, you do the whole total picture there. If I'm right, and if what a lot of Bible scholars are right about this, it's a 490-year period, the 77s. You multiply it out. Then there's a command, and that command for rebuilding Jerusalem happened in 454 BC. Now there could be some debates about whether that is accurate or not, but I think most people that have really looked at it pretty carefully are pretty agreed upon the fact that, yeah, that's the command, that the leader of Persia, it wasn't Cyrus at this point because Cyrus had already died, but the leader allows Jerusalem to be rebuilt. He allows them not to just to do the temple now, but to be rebuilding the city walls. So that command goes forth in 454 BC. So then, if you look at that, first 7 weeks that it talked about in verse 25, that means there's 49 years. So going from 454 to that would take us to 405 BC. Remember, years are going back. So that's when the 7-year period, or the 7 weeks, the first 7 weeks, is completed. And then right on the beginning of that, from 405 to 30, now you have the 62 weeks. So the debate is, well, what happens at this point right here at this 49 years? And that's when I said there's a lot of, different theories about what happens, but that definitely seems to be a pretty big year, because now the streets of Jerusalem have been kind of completed and they have their city walls back up. So it seems to be a reference to what happened in the past, future-wise, that, hey, yeah, finally after 49 years, we've got a lot of our pieces of the puzzle put together. And it could even be that that's when a lot of all the biblical books are completed. Now we don't know that for sure. There's a lot of debate about that, but it could be that that's when the Old Testament books, at least, that all the prophets have spoken their words now, and that's what happens at that 7 years. There's, like I said, there's a lot of different theories about that, and I don't want to get too hung up on that, because, as I said, chapter 9 of Daniel really doesn't tell us what specifically happens at that time period. But then in verse, although some do argue, well, it's talking about the streets being rebuilt, and that fits. The key thing to see here is then we'll keep going then, go another 62 sevens, or another 62 weeks, which is 434 years, and look where that takes us. That takes us to the time of Christ, 30 AD, his ministry. Specifically, it takes us to his crucifixion, because remember, as I've shared with you, the calendar that we have today is off by about 3 years. Scholars say anywhere from 2 to 4 years. Some will say 5 years, 6 or 7 years. In any way you look at it, it's a really specific period that it's taking us to the fact that this prophecy of the 7 and the 62, which is 69 sevens, or 69 weeks, this takes us to the time of Christ. And that would make sense, because in verse 26 it says, after the 62 sevens, or after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. So this seems to fit a very logical prophecy, that 69 weeks takes us to the time of Christ. So then what happens? Well, then you have this 1 week hanging then, right? Because this whole prophecy started with 70 sevens, not 69 sevens, but 70 sevens. Well, that one more week there is that 7-year time period, again, that most people refer to as the tribulation. I think it's more accurately described as Daniel's 70th week. I think that it's probably the nomenclature we should use. We should refer it to that more than saying it's the tribulation period, because the really, really bad tribulation is really during the last half of that time period. So there's where you, excuse me, there's where you get the 70. You got the 7, then the 62, and the 1. When you add up those, now you get that complete 490 years. Yes, I am arguing and admitting that between the 62 and the last week, there is a long period of time. I think the New Testament supports that, though, too, because it refers to a time of the Gentiles. Now, some say, well, that goes all the way back to beginning with the destruction of Jerusalem. I think that's true, but I think the more specific reference is to the fact that, hey, we've got this time period now where the mystery of God is going to be revealed. What's the mystery? The fact that the Gentiles can be part of all this too. Now, that was always to be the case, but what I think the New Testament is revealing to us is no, but Jewish people, you were really missing the point that you were supposed to be bringing in Gentile people into the kingdom of God. That's the mystery. And that's what you've seen. You've seen 2,000 years now where you've got this incredible growth of the body of Christ. And I'm talking about worldwide now, where you have billions of people that have come under God's command. They've become part of God's kingdom at the time of the Gentiles. And most of them are not Jewish people. So I think that's what that gap is. And then at some point, and I don't want to sound like I'm a complete dispensationalist, but that does make a lot of sense, that there's a time period that the Gentiles are coming in. And at some point now, God's going to come back and begin his ministry to the Jewish people again. And Paul makes reference to that in Romans. He says, when the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, and he talks about, their eyes have been blinded for a time, but someday they're going to come back. So I think we're still in that time period where their eyes are kind of blinded. Not every Jewish person, but a lot of them still don't follow Jesus. The vast majority of them don't. So we're still in that time period where a lot of the growth is still mostly among Gentile believers. But you're beginning to see and feel that shift a little bit, aren't you? Or it's kind of shifting back to the Jewish people. And that our call, if you will, is becoming more and more as Gentiles to bring the Jewish people back. To say, hey, you know what? Jesus is your leader too. I mean, look what he's done. You're back in your country now, and he's got a future for you. And there needs to be a revival that needs to happen in Israel. So when you look at it all that way, I think that's what makes the most sense of the entire prophecy of Daniel chapter 9. So I'm going to stop there, because then chapter 10, 11, and 12, which go together in Daniel, definitely we know that this is a prophecy that happens later in the 3rd year. So all of this stuff we've been talking about is all part of this kind of the beginning of the Jewish people going back. That 70-year period is happening. But Gabriel comes to Daniel and says, hey, Daniel, yeah, it's not just a 70 years, but there's 70 weeks, 77s that are going to be fulfilled to really get us to the last of the end days. So it's a kind of a prophecy of top of a prophecy. So that's what makes the most sense. I better go back on this slide. I don't want to get you that confused. That's for next time. So hopefully that all made sense. And again, it's there are some scholars that do disagree with this future interpretation of it, but I think I can safely say that most are on board with the fact that Daniel chapter 9 is a reference to Jesus' crucifixion, and that there's this other 70th week still out there waiting to happen. That would be the futurist perspective, I guess, if you will, of Daniel chapter 9. And it really is the one that I have settled on as well. It makes the most sense. There's just nothing else that really, or any of these time periods, fulfill anything else in any logical type of a way. And trying to say that it's all been fulfilled in the past, in my opinion, totally takes away from verse 24, which is clearly a reference to the end. When it starts talking about to bring in everlasting righteousness, well, we are not in a time period of everlasting righteousness. That is definitely a future fulfillment. Some scholars will say, well, that started at the cross, or that was fulfilled at the cross. Says, well, yes, it was, but we are not living in a world yet with everlasting righteousness. Vision and prophecy has not been sealed up yet. It has not all been fulfilled. That's the only way vision and prophecy can be fulfilled. For it to be sealed is if it's been fulfilled. So that hasn't happened yet. So there's still something that needs to happen in the future. And that's why I believe that so much of Daniel is definitely end days type of stuff. So I'm definitely in that camp. I probably don't agree with so many of them that how then they carry out that 7 years, how that all unfolds. Like I've said, I'm more of the persuasion of more of the what we call the pre-wrath position. I do think we're going to be here for a lot of those 7 years, but hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully we get taken out before that 7 years. But you're not going to see any real allusions to that in the book of Daniel. That's something that's more of a kind of a New Testament interpretation of certain passages. So anyway, but I don't want to get carried away with all that. I just wanted you to see Daniel chapter 9 at this point. So hopefully that all made sense. And again, I will eventually post some more information if you really like to go study this some more and kind of see how it all plays out, and especially to kind of see where different scholars fall then within this, because there's some really fascinating interpretations within that 7 years, how it all plays out, and especially as we get chapter 10, 11, and 12 now, there's all kinds of different opinions in terms of what's going to happen. But the one thing I think we can be pretty certain of is that there's a future 7-year period that's coming. We may not know even when it starts, but it's coming, and it's going to get exciting when all that happens, because then Jesus is going to come back and set up his throne on this kingdom, and we won't have to have all these political battles anymore. It'll be one king, and it'll be awesome, and he will be reigning and ruling. Okay, I will stop there, and you guys be blessed, and we will see you in the next session where we will deal with chapters 10, 11, and 12. Lord bless.